Hey, good morning everyone, and welcome to Sunday morning here with the Dupes. Unfortunately, my wife and kids have deserted me this morning and you are stuck with me. I hope you've had a good week, and I'm excited to just spend a couple of moments with you on some things which I think are pretty important, or at least to Jesus they were. And if you do consider yourself a follower of Jesus, then I think the things that were important to him should also be important to us. So last week we spoke about letting go of the past, and we did that from the book of Mark. And so today we're still in the book of Mark, and we're going to move on a little bit later in chapter 9. We're going to move on to verse 33. And in verse 33, there's this little dispute between the disciples. And so today's topic is letting go of ego. Many people will refer to ego as the false self, that part of you that's instinctual, that part that comes almost from our biology and our very deep past, that defends us, promotes ourselves. And in contrast to this, we of course have the life of Jesus, which looks quite drastically different, and spend a lot of his time really trying to confront that, I would say, within himself, but also within those around him. And here in Mark 9:33 and the other portion in Mark 10 we'll be dealing with today, specifically the disciples. And you can imagine Jesus taking on these fishermen mainly, and trying to get through their heads the things that are so different in the kingdom of God. So maybe I can say I really think that ego is probably one of the greatest culprits of suffering in the world. We could maybe cite some contemporary examples on the world stage, but we could also just look inward and look into our own lives and realize that times when we defended our ego or allowed our ego to roam freely can very often have disastrous consequences in our families, marriages, our relationships, business, every sphere of life. Now, Jesus stands in contrast to the ego strongly, and today we're going to be spending a couple of moments on exactly this. Now, let me just start by saying that I'm not sure I'm the one that should be raising this issue. I consider myself quite competitive. I realized that in the later part of my years that I am competitive. It took me a while to realize this, but I want to be first, and if I can't be first, I'm not really that happy. I'm not a bad or a sore loser, but my determination is always to be first. And as we always say, second is the first of the losers. And so this competitiveness can become a problem. And the competitiveness, it can be healthy. I mean, healthy competition is obviously nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes an obsession, or it becomes a primary goal, even when we deal with our relationships with people, that becomes a problem. I'm not talking about athletes that try to run and win, of course, but in conversations, in debates, in relationships, to want to be first all the time, that ego that jumps up in those moments can truly be disastrous. And so we find in Mark 9:33 the disciples are disputing something, and when they eventually catch up with Jesus, he asked them, what is it that you guys were disputing along the way? And verse 34 said they held their peace. They were quite quiet about it, because they had disputed who should be the greatest. So the word greatest here is protos, which means the foremost, the first, the foremost in time, in order, in rank, and in importance. So this is nothing strange for humanity, and not even the disciples are immune to these urges of trying to find out who is first. And in my life as a pastor for the last 18 years, and being involved in many pastors' meetings, and having many pastors' friends, and being thoroughly exposed to church culture to some degree, I realized that this is, it permeates everything. It's not just out there in the world, in the business circles. It's in the church. It's in pastors. It's amongst pastors. We want to be first. We want to be those of most importance. it's an instinctual thing, and it's I would like to say a natural thing, which it is. But Jesus is the one that says, guys, we got to get this thing in check, because this desire always to be first actually leads into serious problems. It leads to a celebration and a celebrity status, which we know has never been good for anyone. Fame is never really a great thing. Although many people chase fame, others get fame or it gets added to them because of their success. But I think especially in the church we need to be careful of trying to acquire a celebrated life, or a life that has to be celebrated by others, or step into the realm of celebrity, because this desire to be first is absolutely detrimental to what the church is supposed to be. So let me just go to verse 35. And he sat down, this is Jesus, in the house in Capernaum, and he called the 12 to himself, and he said, and he makes this statement. I love Mark's version of this. Matthew and Luke seems to be quite exaggerated on this, or extrapolated or embellished, but Mark says it in one simple line, and this is it. Let me read the King James here. It says, if any man desires to be first, that man will be last of all and servant of all. So let's just spend a couple of moments on that powerful little sentence. If anyone desires, the word desires here is not if anyone is or anyone only wants to, but the word really means to. If anyone is determined to be first, determined to be protos Greek word here, meaning foremost in time, wants to be first, served first, in place, position, in order, or in importance or in influence. If anyone desires this, Jesus says, he shall be last. Now, this statement seems obvious, and I know that you've heard this many times, but I've realized that for many years in my own life, I have used this verse as a kind of a formula. And I'm going to be very vulnerable and open here, because I realize I did this subconsciously, sometimes consciously, but most of the time subconsciously. And so how I took this verse, and I think how many people take this verse by the way that we act, it kind of betrays how we actually take this verse. We think this verse says, if you want to be first, you need to become last. This is not what it actually says. It says, if you are determined to be first, you will be last. It doesn't say, if you want to be first, become last. Why? Because the desire to be first does never leave us if we just use it as if I want to be first, okay, so what do I need to do to be a pastor or a person or a church person or just a normal person of influence, of importance, of order and time, rank, etc. How do I get there? Well, I have to humble myself, and I have to start to become the least, and I have to serve, and then I will eventually become the first. This is how we take this verse. The point I'm trying to make is that Jesus' statement it actually says something else. It says, get rid of the desire to be first. And what we've done with this verse is we've said, okay, we're not getting rid of the desire to be first. We have now a method of how we will become first. We will serve. We will make ourselves last, so that God will then eventually make us first. When in fact what Jesus was saying is, rid yourself of the desire and the determination to be first. Now these are two very different things. We turn Jesus' words into a formula on how to be first, on how to end up first in the end, right? So we serve so that we can be served. We prefer others before ourselves, so that eventually they would prefer us above themselves. We honor others so that they would honor us. We are really actually missing the point completely. We are riding the system, we are tweaking the system, and we are twisting the principle. Humility is not a way to get greatness. It's not just a step to be climbed. humility is greatness. In fact, the heading given to this little portion is the greatness of humility. And so I want to just highlight this morning a very big distinction here. There is a difference between saying, I'm going to be last so that I will be first. In other words, I have a desire to be first. Therefore, I will humble myself for a time. I will take some punches on the nose. I will serve because my desire is eventually to be first. And this is how Jesus said I can get ahead. That is one thing. There's a completely another idea, which I think really is Jesus' idea, and it's this. Humility is the greatness. Serving is the greatness. This is not a formula for becoming first. This is the way to humble ourselves. Humility is the greatness. So if you can understand what I'm trying to lay out here, there's two things here. We can use this little verse as a formula, but never rid ourselves of the desire and the determination to be first, and that's the cancer. We have to realize that humility is actually the greatness. To be last is really the greatness. So that changes things up slightly. The reality is we twist this thing automatically and almost subconsciously. Our self-preservation instincts reign supreme, and they turn any good principle into a formula for self-exaltation. So we really have to be careful that we don't turn this verse into a formula to be first. And we never actually get rid of this desire to really be first. Because the point is this, that if you're only serving because you want to be first, you've missed the point completely. If we're only serving so that in the end others would serve us, we're missing the point of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying here, if you keep on humbling yourself, then you will be first. He is saying, those who will desire and are determined to be first, they will end up last. Now, take that for what it says. Get rid of the desire to be first. So, we need a conscious and really a deliberate reorientation into the real life of Jesus. I think like a mindfulness, a contemplation, and a meditation upon what he really is requiring of us. I think we are running on auto in Christianity, which is kind of like, I think, what had happened to me and also happens to many people with the scriptures and the teachings, kind of in the back of our heads, quickly reading over them and just fitting them into our culture. It's not going to do that for us. It's not going to reorientate us. It's not going to really make us followers. And we're going to end up in traps like this, where whenever another way to explain this maybe is to give to get, instead of giving for the sake of giving. When we give to someone, is to then expect something back. And then, in fact, that wasn't giving at all, was it? If we're always expecting something back. So this is the important point that I would like to make in this first little portion here. We have to rid ourselves of the desire to be first, because that's really, as the love for money in the parallel example, the love for money is the root of all evil. You can add onto something like that the desire to be first is the root of all strife. It's the root of all backbiting. It's the root of all jealousy. It's the root of all gossip. It's a thing that really kills us, kills relationships, kills churches, kills families. And so if we're really going to be following Jesus, we can follow him into buildings and into services, but we really, above all of that, should be following his example of ridding himself of the desire to be first. And I think that's the place where peace really resides. That's really the place where peace can be found. Dealing with this desire, this ego that wants to win in every conversation, wants to win in every meeting, wants to win at everything in life. Once again, just want to clarify, I'm not against running your best in a race, and that's not really what we're talking about here. We're also not talking about being successful and wanting to be successful. We're talking about humility in relationships and being willing to be the servant in the situation. So I've seen many beautiful examples of people doing that, and I have to admit that many of those examples have not been even with Christians, people who understand how to take the low road in every situation, and that's really the best road. So, a quick example from Mark 10. Now this is a chapter and a half later. Jesus has just kind of, like, we haven't finished the whole portion there, but he's kind of said to these guys, look, if you're disputing about who's going to be first, you will end up last. Get rid of this determination, this determinedness to want to be first. Get rid of it. But in Mark 10, we got James and John, called the sons of thunder, and verse 35. Let me just get there quickly. James and John, they were brothers, sons of Zebedee. And they came to him. They said, Master, we want that you do for us whatever we desire. Now, this is quite interesting. I've always laughed at this little portion here. Master, we want you to do for us exactly or whatsoever we will desire. This sounds much like a lot of modern Christianity to me. I mean, and why start the sentence with master at all? Why not just start it with genie? Genie, we wish that you will do for us exactly what we shall desire. Master is really not really the word that's fitting here. And maybe sometimes we do think like this, that God only exists to do for us what we want, to get our breakthrough, get our blessing, and we will go through and jump through whatever hoops we need to do that. But here's their request then now. He said to them, what do you want? What do you want me to do for you? Jesus said, and they said, grant to us that we want to sit one in your right and one in your left hand in your glory. This is the desire to be first. This is the determinedness to be in a place of firstness. On the right hand is the first place, the left hand is the second place. But this is pretty clear that they want to be in place of authority. They want to be first amongst the disciples even. I mean, it's not really so much a question of everybody else. It's about amongst the disciples. They want to be first. And you know that James and John already was kind of in Jesus's inner circle to some degree. He used to take them with Peter to some really special and secluded and important places. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to be the first. And of course, Jesus wasn't just going to let this go, because this is a really important matter. Jesus said to them, you don't know what you ask. And then he asked them a question. Can you drink the cup that I am drinking of, or that I will drink? And can you be baptized with the baptism that I will be baptized with? Now, for those of you who don't know, the cup and the baptism here really speaks of his suffering and the things that he had to endure. The humiliation he had to endure, the pain, the betrayal, the mocking, the physical death, the physical pain, the pain in the soul, the depression, the solitude, all of the horrible sufferings that he had to walk through. And so when they ask, can we be first? He doesn't say, well, if you're willing to do A, B, C, and D, we'll make a plan. He doesn't do that. All he says is, how low can you go? And I think to me it's a startling statement. I consider my own life, and many times my ambitions or my wanting to be first in certain situations, in arguments, in placements, in meetings, or whatever it might be. The response of Jesus is not, humble yourself and then I'll make you first. The response of Jesus is, Frans, how low can you go? How much can you endure? And so he doesn't promise them anything. He says, look, it's not for me to decide who sits where. All I'm asking you, can you drink the cup of suffering and the baptism of fire that I'm about to take? So we asked them, really, how low can you go? Can you suffer with me? Can you be humiliated with me? After confirming that they will suffer with him, he still does not promise them the foremost position they ask for. The suffering is not a recipe for success or promotion. Humbling yourself or being the servant or making yourself last is not the formula or the method to get ahead. Become first. You have to rid yourself of the desire to be first. You have to rid yourself of the ego part of your life. Some will call it the false self, the ego, the thing that, as I said earlier, that it's there instinctually, and by the Spirit of God, I think we need to lay that thing to rest. But becoming last does not guarantee you becoming first. And verse 42 of Mark 10, Jesus calls them. He says to them, you know, and he speaks to them about the rulers of the Gentiles or of the nations. And he says, the Gentile or the nations rulers, they execute authority over people. And then he says, but it's not going to be like this amongst you. And so it's almost like he's warning them. He says, even if you can attain that first position, you're still in the wrong place. I need you at the bottom. I need you at the low point. That's where the greatness resides. This is not a race to see who's first. And I think a lot of problems, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, especially in church circles, have come from people, pastor, elder, churchgoer, whoever you are, humbling yourself so that God will make you first. I think it's a problem. And I think really what we need to look at here is a reorientation of the desire that we have. I think to realize that making ourselves last, becoming servant of others, humbling ourselves is the greatness that God is actually looking for. It's not a method to the greatness. It's not a step into success, influence, power, glory, whatever, money, whatever. Humility is the goal. It's not just a method or a means to another end. So Jesus says plainly, he says, look, it's not going to be so amongst you. And then he kind of repeats what he said in in Mark 9. He says, for whoever determines to be great will be your servant. And whoever determines to be first, protos, in time, place, order, importance, he will be a slave of all. And so I'd like to look at this in a slightly different view here, because I've always looked at this and said, okay, so basically I need to be slave, I need to be servant, then God will put me first and make me great. But really what's going on here is he is saying, if you don't leave your determination to be always first and always the greatest, it's going to cause you to become the least. So just a little check in motive, I think, for us to say, hey, why am I humbling myself? Am I doing this because I know this is the way, because this is what God is, how God acts? Or am I doing this to get something else? Just a little check. But then in verse 45 of Mark 10 is the most powerful part of all of this. Jesus doesn't just teach them what to do, but he actually refers to himself as an example. In verse 45 he says, for even the Son of Man, in other words, even this me, really, but he uses the third person here in some sense, the Son of Man, which is a prophetic term for the Messiah that would come, sent from God that would come. He says he did not come to be ministered to, but he came to minister. So he didn't come to minister so that he can be ministered to. No, he didn't come to be ministered to at all. He came to minister. There's a difference. And then he explains what this minister, because minister, I think, is the word diakonos. It means to serve and to attend to. But he qualifies this and brings in probably his greatest accomplishment, I guess, which is giving his life away on the cross. But he says, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so even in the example of Jesus, it's quite clear that his motivation for ministering is not to be one day ministered to, but that his motivation for ministry is love, that he gives himself away. Now, I know in some circles, I know for most definitely in my past, there was always this idea that in church or church area, I'm using church, it's kind of my history, but you know, if you serve long enough, God will promote you. Like, in other words, if you move the chairs long enough, at some point you'll become an elder or a deacon, and then you'll get the mic, and then you'll be able to preach, and that's the main deal. But if that's our motivation, if we're only serving or humbling ourselves because it serves our determination to be great and first, missing the point completely. Humility is the greatness. Serving is the greatness. Giving our lives for others, that is the greatness that God is looking for. And he uses his own life as an example. So just to jump back to Mark 9, the last little portion there, which we didn't cover, in verse 36, after Jesus tells them that if you're determined to be first, you're going to end up last, he then takes a little child. Like, we know Jesus obviously many times spoke about being childlike. He takes a child, he puts him in the midst. Now, a child is the lowest. I mean, you know, if you think about a child in adult circle, standing in an adult circle, for instance, you expect the least from the child. You expect the least wisdom, the least knowledge, the least action, the least understanding. It's a humble position. But Jesus takes that child, puts him in front of him, and then he puts his arm around them, and he says to the disciples, he says, if you receive a child in my name, you receive me, and whosoever receives me receives not me, but the one who has sent me. And this is a kind of a metaphor that he demonstrates for them. And I think what is basically going on here saying is that he is saying that if you receive the humble, you receive God. That's basically what he is saying. And so first he tells them that being humble is the greatness. And when you do humble yourself, or rather when you do receive people who have done so, you are receiving God. And I don't think we've thought that through properly. I don't think I have seen great application of that. Coming to the realization that the way we treat the humble is the way that we treat God. That God expects us to treat the humble. The word receive here in the Strong's means to embrace the humble, to make them one of you. In other words, to receive them, to approve of them, to befriend them, to even learn from them. And I think the reason we have found it very hard to apply this properly in our own lives is simply because we don't realize that God is the humble. And I think that's the big difference. And I think that's where we really lack, is not understanding that God is the humble. So it seems then that God puts himself in the camp of the humble. That when we receive the humble, we receive him. And when we come to the conclusion that God truly is humility and is humble by nature, maybe a little bit different than what we might have thought, or maybe even what the Israelites might have thought and might have recorded for us, maybe then you'll realize that humility is the greatness God is looking for. And that becoming first it's tiresome, and it has big pitfalls. And having a desire for that, an ambition for that, actually brings us down to the lowest places. So I want to challenge you today by asking you, is Jesus really asking us to humble ourselves without expectations? Is he really asking us to follow in his example of laying our lives down and surrendering this desire, this ambition to be first? And I think he is. And then my question to myself is, Frans, are you really a follower of Jesus? Or have you just become a follower of the religion started in his name? Are we just using his words to prolong our own desires and to promote our own egos? I want to challenge you today by reminding you of Jesus' words. The desire to be first leads to trouble, leads to loss. Humble yourself. That's the place of greatness. I encourage you this week, think about this in your engagements with those around you. Take the low road. When thoughts come that say, Frans, you need to be first here. You can't let them trample over you. You need to say something. You need to continue the argument. I remember the words of Jesus. How low can you go? How low can you go? Guys, thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday and a great week. I'll see you next week again, 10:30. Cheers.